to biologics. Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea, Customs and Border Protection is on the front line serving to protect American agriculture, natural resources, and public health. CBP is here to enforce the biological threat exclusion regulations that are established by all the multiple other government agencies. CBP agriculture specialists are trained to regulate biologic material in accordance with U.S. Department of Agriculture. Be aware there's over 186 ports of entry that are staffed by agriculture specialists. We have a total of a little over 2,716 agriculture specialists on board. So there are some of the smaller ports of entry where agriculture is not staffed. So be aware of that when you're making your plans to import and export biologics. The majority of the ag specialists hold a 4-year degree in a biologic field. Some have masters, and there's quite a few out there that actually hold PhDs as well. Next slide, please. So to give you an idea of what will happen when you arrive at a port of entry at the Federal Inspection Station, the first Customs and Border Protection individual you'll encounter will be the CBP officer on the primary line. This is the officer where you're going to want to make your declaration to indicate that you are bringing in some biologic material. That officer will then complete his inspection when it comes to the immigration and some custom enforcement issues, and he or she will then make sure to refer you to agriculture secondary, where you'll encounter an agriculture specialist. The agriculture specialist, as mentioned before, will be able to apply the regulatory requirements for USDA to the biologic. They would also refer the biologic to any other government agency that would have an interest in regulating your biologic. Be aware that very often biologic shipments may be regulated by more than one agency. So it gets complicated with all these different agencies involved. We're here to help. If need be, you can call a port of entry, ask to speak to an agriculture specialist or manager, ask your regulatory questions. They can provide answers, or they can put you in touch with some subject matter experts that we have, such as our biologic threat exclusion coordinators that we have available to help you through the process. Next slide, please. So as you may know, all imports and exports of biologic material are subject to inspection. It is the importer's and shipper's responsibility to comply with all applicable shipping regulations, including permits, certifications, packaging, and labeling requirements. Be aware that many large institutions and universities do have legal offices, health and safety offices, and some even have brokers already contracted that can help you through the import-export process. I encourage you to take advantage of these resources that may already be available to you at your institution. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to talk about the cargo environment. This is an environment where you can ship your biologic through. The advantage of shipping your biologic through the cargo environment is that you can provide your documents and your shipment information regarding your biological before the shipment arrives at the port of entry. Filing of the entry is done in an electronic system, the Automated Commercial Environment, known as ACE, and there's also a digital imaging system where you can upload the documents. This makes the documents available to the agriculture specialist to review on pre-arrival before the shipment arrives. At that time, the agriculture specialist can review the shipment and determine if a referral for a physical inspection is needed. Upon arrival of the shipment, we could take advantage of some of our non-intrusive technology, such as X-ray, to see what we can see in the shipment, and then the shipment would be referred for inspection at that time. Next slide, please. So here's a visual aid to show you how it will progress through the cargo environment. Next slide, please. Next, we'll talk about the passenger environment. And again, the downfall about bringing biologics in through the passenger environment is there's no opportunity for ag specialists to review documents prior to arrival. It's most important that the traveler declare the biologic to the officer on primary. It's very important the traveler know what the biologic contains that they're carrying. Is it of animal origin? What's in the petri dish? What's in the vial? It's also important that the traveler have documents on hand, the permits, certifications, any letters relating to the biologics so that we can take a look at that and review the information. Interviews and questioning will take place, the referral to the secondary agriculture specialist. Again, we'll use the non-intrusive technology and we'll conduct the inspection of the material and associated documents. If all meets the requirements, it will be released. Next slide, please. So again, I cannot reiterate the importance of declaring the biologic material that's in your possession when you arrive and encounter the primary officer. Very important, failure to declare biologic materials to the CBP can result in delays, penalties, possible revocation of trusted traveler status, criminal prosecution, or seizure and loss of biologic material. So declare, declare, declare. Next slide, please. Here's a visual aid of how things progress through the passenger environment. Again, it's very important prior to getting on the aircraft that you notify the airline that you are bringing the biologic onto their aircraft, so they will have it and they'll transmit the manifest and you'll proceed through the passenger environment. Next slide, please. So again, as stated before, it's all these other government agencies that set the regulatory requirements, and CBP enforces the requirements. So we'll take a quick look at some of the other government agencies, and of course you'll be hearing more in-depth info from representatives from these agencies. So in the case of USDA, as I said, the ag specialists are fully trained in applying the regulations, the USDA regulations to biologic material. USDA sets the regulatory requirements for Title VII and Title IX, and it's to protect against the introduction of pests and disease agents into the country. They also set requirements for the USDA select agents, the Virus Serum Toxin Act. Last line shows the permit website where you can apply for the permit. It's suggested you apply for the permit a couple weeks out so that you have time to receive the permit and then meet the regulatory requirements of the permit prior to setting up your shipping requirements, and then also to meet regulatory requirements of any other government agency that may have regulatory authority over your biologic. There is a possibility that the permit office may determine that your biologic does not need a USDA permit, at which time they may issue a letter of no jurisdiction to indicate your biologic does not need a permit. Very important piece of paper for you to get to the agriculture specialist, whether you upload it into the ACE system or hand a physical copy of the document to the agriculture specialist. It could very well help to expedite your biologic through the release process. Also, you do want to be aware that the USDA permits do have expiration dates, so make sure and take note of that so you can renew your permit as needed. Next slide, please. So another government agency that may regulate biologics is U.S. Fish and Wildlife. They enforce Title 50 CFR, which covers wildlife and fisheries, covers all these legislative acts listed. The CITES of Wild Fauna and Flora is the Committee on International Trade in Endangered Species. So in a nutshell, if your biologic includes ingredients that are derived from an endangered or protected species, you may be required to get a permit issued by Fish and Wildlife. So do be aware that Fish and Wildlife is not present at all ports of entry. So only certain ports of entry are designated as Fish and Wildlife. So please make sure and do your research to identify the ports of entry that you plan to travel through. Again, there's the permit website for you to access the information. Next slide, please. Another government agency that sets regulatory requirements is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And again, they enforce Title 42, etiological agents, hosts, and vectors of human disease, Health and Human Service select agents. There's their website listed. Of course, the CDC is interested in infectious biologic agents, materials known to contain infectious biologic agents, as well as vectors of human disease. So be aware that if the CDC permit office determines your biologic does not need a CDC permit, they may issue you a CDC informational letter of non-infectious material. That's an important piece of information you would want to hand over to the agriculture specialist to help expedite the release of your biologic. Important information to share. Next slide, please. Okay, the Food and Drug Administration is another government agency that may regulate your biologics. Examples of some items that FDA regulates: antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, hormones, growth factors, just to name a few. Thing to keep in mind with FDA is there is a prior notice of arrival requirement to meet. So be sure that you meet the prior notice of arrival prior to arrival. If you're coming by air, it's a 4-hour notice, prior notice. If you're coming by land, it's 2 hours. By maritime, it's 8 hours. By mail, it's 5 days. So be aware of that requirement. And the permit office is also listed on the slide. Next slide, please. The Environmental Protection Agency is another government agency that may regulate your biologic. Of course, they regulate the Toxic Substance Control Act. Be aware that some toxic substances could contain microorganisms, bacteria, virus, fungi, algae, protozoa. Of course, it's covered under Title 40. You can also find some Toxic Substance Control Act exemptions. Be aware there is a pre-manufacturer notification requirement that must be met for new chemical substances. So make sure and do your homework. Website has a lot of information. Next slide, please. Federal Aviation Administration is another government agency, and they set the regulatory requirements for Title 49, hazardous materials regulations, transportation requirements for infectious substances. This website has a lot of information to help you understand the packaging and labeling requirements prior to shipping. Next slide, please. So be aware, in the case of the USDA, there's quite a few biologic material that does not require a USDA permit. However, USDA, if you go to the link below that's in red font, it'll take you to USDA website where they list 15 different guidelines to follow for items that are considered to be low risk and exempted from the animal origin ingredients and products requiring permits. So these guidelines are well written. They provide certain statements that are required to be provided on official letterhead. And if you have those statements on the letterhead and you provide it to the agriculture specialist, it will greatly help to expedite you through the process. Next slide, please. Okay, before we cover the outreach slide, I just want to let you know that there's another important aspect to keep in mind: the intellectual property rights related to your research. The intellectual property rights holders could be yourself, the institution that you work for, also those that are funding your research. So be sure to consult with your legal office to ensure that if you're going to share your information, that you're not infringing on the intellectual property rights of any of the rights holders. Very important. That can get you in trouble pretty quickly if you're infringing on someone's IPR rights. So this slide lists a couple outreach initiatives CBP has taken to increase our biologic awareness. Next slide, please. So this slide shows you a peek at what information is available to you at cbp.gov. You can navigate to the biologic page. As you can see, the icons for all the other government agencies, if you click on those icons, it'll take you directly to their site, give you a wealth of information to meet the regulatory requirements for your biologics. Next slide, please. So very important slide. Here's my email. Should you have any questions as you're conducting research to get this figured out, encourage you to reach out. Also listed is our biological threat exclusion coordinator, Mr. George Amerson. Give us a call or send us an email, and we can respond to your questions and get you the information that you need. All right, that completes my presentation. We do have a couple minutes to field some questions. Encourage you to type in your questions in the chat box. Sean and Adam, is there any questions in the chat box at this time?
Hi, Mary. This is Adam. There is a question in there from Mary Louise Faber. Does the FDA regulate importing a medical device that does not have FDA, I'm assuming, approval, and will only be used for research purposes in the U.S. lab? Who does the lab reach out to? Thanks. I don't know if there is somebody. I think there is an FDA person on the call. If that's something they could handle, that'd be great. If not, the BTEC's here on the call. We can research that one and get back to Ms. Faber.
We do have FDA scheduled to speak tomorrow. If we can table that question and bring it up during their presentation.
Absolutely, yeah. I'll hold on to that one, and we'll pose it to them and do a little research during the day and get back to you.
Any other questions?
Yep, one just popped in from Paula Moravik. If a biological is being sent by a foreign collaborator, who sets up the permits, the sender or recipient? So that would be the importer. You are the one receiving the biological, so that would be you.
Yeah, typically USDA permits can only be held by someone in the U.S.
Yeah. And if you need assistance with that, we can help you with that too. But yeah, it should be whoever is intending on receiving the material here in the U.S.
Any other questions?